At last, a voice for the people who pay big government's bills, not the people who make big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. I'm your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And this is Rachel Slobodian.
Welcome, Gimme Radio listeners, to the latest edition of our little show here. And exciting it is indeed, because exciting events themselves are occurring on Capitol Hill, with the Senate Committee on Finance's vote to release to the floor a huge overhaul of the healthcare system. Other pieces have to be put into this legislation, but it is obviously on the move. And as it is moving, National Taxpayers Union is trying to examine its parts, and we're not liking what we see. A lot of hidden taxes buried in that legislation. Is that not correct, Rachel?
It is, and people have to be careful because, it was a little difficult to even examine a bill that hadn't been written, but now that it's been written, people have to be careful to comb through all of the different types of hidden tax measures we can find in it.
And one such proposal that caught our eye was actually raised by Michigan Senator Debbie Stabenow, who said that the proposal in the health care bill to limit the deductibility of medical expenses won't hurt a whole lot of people. What proposal is she talking about? Well, it's a little complicated, but it goes like this. In order to deduct unreimbursed medical expenses of certain kinds, a taxpayer who is itemizing using the 1040 long form has to have medical expenses in excess of 7.5% of his or her adjusted gross income. The amount that's above that 7.5% is deductible. Well, the Senate's proposal would raise that threshold to 10%, meaning you would have to have more medical expenses in order to begin to qualify for the medical expense deduction. Sounds complex, but the bottom line is this. Many Americans who had previously counted on being able to deduct some medical costs from their taxes won't be able to do that anymore. Senator Stabenow says that will only affect the wealthiest of Americans, but IRS statistics tell a completely different story. Take a look, for example, at the tax year 2007 income tax return filing data. That is the most current available from the IRS. Tax year 2007 are returns filed in calendar year 2008, so they're still very fresh, very current. According to that document, out of some 140 million tax filers, there are 10.6 million who actually itemize unreimbursed medical expense deductions and qualify for them. Okay, now the IRS very conveniently breaks down that deduction data by income. How many people do you suppose out of that 10.6 million who itemize medical expense deductions actually make $250,000 or more a year? Remember, that $250,000 number is a golden threshold because that's the level that Barack Obama says he will only tax more at. In other words, anybody making $250,000 or below won't be paying higher taxes under any of his policies. Senate Democrats and House Democrats tend to echo the same thing. Return to that question. How many out of the 10.6 million medical expense deduction tax filers actually made more than $250,000 a year? You want to take a guess, Rachel?
Well, are we talking about according to Senator Stabenow or according to what actually the IRS data reported?
Let's start with reality, shall we?
Actually, it was, I believe, a majority of the taxpayers made less than $50,000, so that certainly falls below that $250,000 mark that Obama promised not to increase taxes on.
Yes, more than 6 million out of that 10.6 ended up having incomes of less than $50,000. And intuitively, that makes sense because anybody with huge out-of-pocket medical expenses who can meet the 7.5% of AGI threshold in the first place is not likely to be super rich. After all, if you were a millionaire and you had $1 million of adjusted gross income, you'd have to have at least $75,000 of unreimbursed medical expenses before you could begin deducting additional medical costs. Who in the world would run up a tab that large right out of their own pocket? Not many people. Maybe if you had to finance a heart transplant or a quadruple bypass all on your own, but very few people would have that kind of huge medical expense and still have a huge income. So again, it's got to be, by intuition, people with relatively modest incomes who have that 7.5% threshold that they can meet. So, getting back to the question, there were only about 50,000 people out of 10.6 million who qualified as rich under Barack Obama's definition, who were taking the unreimbursed medical expense deduction. And yet, Senator Stabenow says, well, our little change in this deduction will only affect the relatively well-off. Okay, once you do the math, you realize Senator Stabenow is dead wrong. Her claims are completely fictitious, and it's not the National Taxpayers Union making that assertion. It's really the IRS's data making that assertion. No, the Internal Revenue Service spokespeople have not called Senator Stabenow wrong or misleading or lying, but the statistics basically have done so. Let's review this, Rachel. What's the breakdown again out of this 10.6 million people who are taking the medical expense deduction?
Out of the 10.6 million, the majority of them actually make less than $50,000 per year.
Okay, and those making under $250,000 out of 10.6 million, 10.55 million of them make less than $250,000. And when you raise the amount of expense you have to have for medical before you can begin deducting it, you are basically raising people's taxes. Will all of those 10.6 million people suddenly become disqualified for the medical expense deduction? Of course not. Many of them will still be able to meet the new higher 10% threshold, but many will not. And one thing's for certain, everybody who originally met the 7.5% threshold and who can meet the 10% threshold will have less of a tax saving out of this. They will be paying higher taxes as a result of making it harder to claim medical expense deductions. How's that for a sneaky middle-class tax hike, folks? This is how Congress operates on both sides of the aisle, I'm afraid. We find people proposing creative fees, clawbacks of deductions, limits on exemptions. All of these things are designed to get around the blatant rate raising that would normally arouse the public's ire. And I think, Rachel, that this is an important lesson for those who believe that we shouldn't be paying too much attention to the details in these bills because, after all, these are hardcore policymakers figuring all this out. How could we possibly understand them? Well, what we don't know will definitely hurt us. Would you agree?
I definitely agree. And I think it's also important to point out that what you did earlier is that how sneaky their tactics are. For example, I think this figure of this increase in percentage came on page 257 of a 259-page bill. So it certainly isn't broadcasted, but it's important that groups like NTU disseminate this information to its members so that they can call their senators and complain about these sneaky tax raises on the middle class.
So there you have it. That's just one of many hidden tax increases in the bill. We're also looking at taxes on medical device providers who will probably pass along the costs for things like contact lenses and wheelchairs to users. A lot of interesting facets of this bill that have very, very grave consequences for taxpayers. and you know who you can count on in the coming weeks to give you the straight story on how the health care bill will affect your bottom line. You know it, the National Taxpayers Union. We'll be here, folks. We're not going to go to sleep. And in this segment, we're going to swing outside of the horrible circus freak show that is Washington, D.C., and get down to the grassroots. Well, maybe not grass. Does that grow in Washington State and Maine? Well, I suppose it does. Maybe not so much as in the great state of Kentucky or elsewhere. But that is neither here nor there, because what we're talking about today is not blades of grass, but taxpayers harvesting tax relief, harvesting spending restraint, harvesting the right of citizens to participate more fully in their government. And here to tell us all about it is the man with the lawnmower, the man who knows where the skeletons are hidden, the man who's working so hard for National Taxpayers Union state and local efforts, our state government affairs manager, Josh Culling. Welcome, sir.
It's good to be here.
Well, I may have given it away, folks, but we're here to talk about two very important measures on the November 2009 ballot. You heard right. These are on the off-year election ballot in the states of Maine and Washington, and they could be triggering a coast-to-coast tax revolt. So we are here to talk a little bit more about these measures and why it's important for everyone in every state of America to know about these great proposals. Josh, why don't you tell us a little bit about the first one in Maine?
Okay. In Maine, on November 3rd, on the ballot will be what is known as Question 4, which is also known as the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, or TABOR. Essentially what TABOR does is it limits the growth of state government spending to the rate of inflation plus population growth on a year-by-year basis. Government is still allowed to grow under TABOR, but it just does so at a responsible rate. The reason for it is to avoid situations like we've had all across the country this year in places like California, New York, Illinois, Jersey, you name it, where in periods of in relatively good economic times, politicians spend money as fast as they can and really just dole out cash and really rapidly increase the size of government. But then when we hit a recession or a bump in the economic road like we're experiencing right now, they don't have nearly enough money to pay for all these things. Budget deficits open up, taxes are increased, or you have rapid, devastating budget cuts. A state like Maine, with the responsible spending cap, such as TABOR, kind of avoids those boom and bust cycles, and it enacts fiscally responsible, prudent budgets. There are a couple other things that TABOR does. It allows voters to approve or deny any new taxes or increases in existing taxes. Rather than being talked at by politicians, they get to be involved in the process. And any surplus revenues over the TABOR limit, over that limit of population growth plus inflation, 80% of that's returned to Maine families via broad-based tax cuts or direct refunds, and 20% goes into a budget stabilization fund, again, to keep everything steady in good times and bad.
Interesting. So this is not just about sort of a give the government away to the wolves approach. We're talking about a very measured and modest role that voters have in approving how much more government they can afford beyond the usual prudent growth level of inflation plus population. This is not about voters approving every single expenditure of government or having to approve every time the state of Maine wants to borrow a dollar or create a new program. This is simply a check or a check and balance on the way government operates to make sure that people are able to afford the government that they're being asked to pay for.
Yeah, we're not asking voters to micromanage legislators' lives or the governor's life. The legislature and the governor's office are still largely in control. It's just that when they want more money, they're going to have to ask for it rather than taking it. And it really forces lawmakers to prioritize and figure out what's really important, what's really necessary for the state to fund, and maybe cut some of the waste or inefficiencies in government. But it's important to understand that under TABOR, We're not talking about cuts in government at all. There are no cuts in government mandated by Tabor. In fact, under Tabor, government continues to get larger. So when you have opponents coming out and saying, oh, there go all the hospitals, firemen, police officers, and schools, they're not telling the truth. Whatever Maine's standard of living is right now, or whatever, I shouldn't say that, whatever Maine's government outlays are right now, there are no cuts that come from Tabor. Government continues to grow.
Very interesting, and in fact, there are some who would contend that the Maine Taxpayer Bill of Rights, also known as Question 4, actually prevents that kind of drastic cutting, actually prevents huge tax increases, because when you have an established growth formula for government spending, when you have that relief valve of voter approval for higher taxes, when you have that budget stabilization fund, you're actually creating a more sustainable, more predictable budget environment than without Tabor. And that's something that benefits the government as well as the citizens, because both sides know where they stand.
Yeah, well, I'd point to the one example of a Tabor that exists in the country. The only similar measure that exists in the United States today is in Colorado. And Colorado's been doing quite well ever since 1992, when citizens amended the Constitution to include a Taxpayers Bill of Rights. It's kind of funny because all of the opponents point to Colorado and say, they have the 47th highest education funding in the country now. Oh, everything's terrible in Colorado. First of all, just anecdotally, go to Colorado. It's a phenomenal place. Great place. One of my favorite places to travel for business. It's absolutely beautiful. But if you look at the numbers, they tell a completely different story than what our anti-Tabor opponents have to say. Colorado has weathered economic turmoil far better than any other state in the country since 1992. You look at the recession of the early part of this decade, in the early Bush years, post 9/11, Colorado was one of the few states that did quite well and was quite calm because they didn't have this boom and bust cycle of budgeting. They kind of just rode it out. Colorado is one of the most favorable business climates in the country. Colorado's added over 1 million people since Tabor was enacted. It's a phenomenal state economically, and especially when compared to some of its neighbors out west. So you're right. The predictability and the consistency that comes with budgeting under Tabor makes it a no-brainer for not only voters and taxpayers, but for those who work in government as well.
And oftentimes, these measures either are proposed or enacted in one form or another. As you mentioned, Tabor in Colorado is obviously the most comprehensive of these limitations. Other states have elements of Tabor in place, but the measures tend to come up in states that are losing their competitive edge because of higher taxes and perpetual budget deficits. And Maine definitely counts as one of those. Maine has one of the worst property tax burdens in the United States today, constantly competing with the great state of New Jersey for that dubious title. Maine's spending, I believe, has increased about twice as fast as inflation and population growth over the past 15 years. So these things are pointing to a very troubled fiscal and economic direction for the state. That's one reason why so many voters are taking to this measure, Question 4, and why so many people have volunteered to try and pass it. They realize that Maine's economic future could be at stake here.
Maine has an abysmal economic climate. I mean, let's just get that out there. It's a bad place to do business. It's a bad place to own property. The taxes are punitive, and that's to fund, frivolous government spending in the state capital. If you look at, let's just go back to choose an arbitrary year. So let's take 1995 in Maine, for example. In that year, the state spent about $3.6 billion. If Tabor was enacted in Maine in 1995, by today, taxpayers would have been refunded $1.6 billion over that time span to spend however they see fit. Over $417 million will be put into a budget stabilization fund over that period of time to help the state weather ups and downs in the economic climate. But instead, this year, they're spending $7.4 billion. They're spending over twice as much as what the Tabor limit would have allowed. So spending in Maine is the problem. It always has been the problem. That's where the taxes come from, because politicians there do not know when to stop. And it's to the point where it's time for Mainers to go to the ballot box and, enact something that will put a restraint on their politicians and not allow them to keep treating them like ATMs.
So, National Taxpayers Union, I believe, is becoming very active in this campaign, not only because it's important for our several thousand members in Maine, but also because it could help to once again reinforce the notion that there is a nationwide tax revolt taking place. We've set up a ballot committee there called, what is that, Maine for Taxpayers?
Yeah, Maine, the number 4, as in question 4, Taxpayers, Maine4Taxpayers.com. We're hard launching that website this week. And it's just going to be kind of a clearinghouse for all sorts of information on Tabor in general, news and updates and polling information, a blog. We'll have a Twitter account. That'll be ME, the number 4, Taxpayers. And, just to really communicate the message in these critical last 3 weeks about why voters in Maine, first of all, why voters in Maine should vote yes on question 4. More importantly, why taxpayers in all other 49 states should care. Because we really see this as an opportunity to kick off another pro-taxpayer revolt across the country. Tabor is a fantastic issue. It almost embodies everything that the National Taxpayers Union is about. Low taxes, spending restraint, citizen involvement. So we encourage our membership all across the country to watch as the question 4 debate unfolds and, be really well informed so that you can pursue similar policies in your state. Maybe heading into 2010.
Excellent. Your National Taxpayers Union through the Maine for Taxpayers Committee is going to be on the ground in Maine. So if you Gimme Radio listeners in Maine are tuning in today, watch for us. We're going to be hitting the airwaves, showing up in print, planting yard signs, pasting bumper stickers on every automobile in the Pine Tree State. That's Maine4Taxpayers.com. Where the tax revolt began in the 1970s, it begins again. Washington State's Initiative 1033 is on the November 2009 ballot, just weeks away. Just a few hundred miles north of California, where the famous Proposition 13 property tax limitation battle took place in 1978, when Howard Jarvis yelled at the top of his lungs, "I'm mad as H-E double toothpicks, and I'm not going to take it anymore." Now Washington State has its turn not only to limit property taxes and cut property taxes, but limit taxes of all kinds. Initiative 1033 would limit the growth rate of local government and state government revenues to the rates of population growth and inflation annually. If revenues exceed that level, then the amounts are refunded to property owners in the form of property tax relief. That also goes through to renters because, of course, renters pay property taxes because they are simply passed along to them in the form of higher rents. So what we're talking about here is a property tax relief and rebate program along with a tax cap program. And your National Taxpayers Union is becoming involved in this race, are they not, Josh?
Yes, we are becoming involved because this is an important fight for the entire country to watch. You mentioned California earlier, and it's important to point out that California has always been a revenue-starved state, and they are, and I say revenue-starved because the politicians think that they need to get their hands on more and more money. It's not that they actually do need it. And California has become an example of what happens when you get revenue-obsessed politicians that will do anything they can to get more and more of their hands on your money. Now, we need to stem that tide, and the way to do it is revenue limitation amendments such as Initiative 1033 in Washington. As you mentioned, it would limit state revenue growth to the rates of population growth plus inflation, and then turn around and anything over that limit get refunded to taxpayers in the form of property tax cuts. It's pretty no nonsense. It kind of ties government's hand and doesn't let them get their hands on too much money so that during a period of recession, they're expecting all this cash to pay for programs that they instituted when times were good, and then you have deficits and so on and so forth.
Interesting, too, that Initiative 1033, according to their proponents, is intended more to restore a balance that once existed in Washington state rather than even introduce a whole new level of limitations. Initiative 601, back about 16 years ago, passed in Washington state, and that generally limited the growth rate of spending in Washington and kept a darn good check on it. It allowed government to grow at a reasonable rate, but of course, governments are never reasonable. They always want more than what's reasonable from their citizens. And over time, from the early 2000s onward, the legislature kept chipping away at that Initiative 601. And what do you know? Spending has skyrocketed in Washington state. Property taxes continue to rise despite the fact that home values are dropping, a horrible trend that we keep seeing across the nation, but especially acute in Washington state. Hence the reason for Initiative 1033 to reestablish some reasonable limits on the growth of government, this time focused on revenues, and to finally do something to provide relief for beleaguered homeowners, renters, and other property owners. And National Taxpayers Union is setting up a ballot committee in Washington state under the website taxpayers41033.com. Is that not correct?
That's correct. It's going to be just sort of a resource for voters in Washington and also across the country to kind of see what the situation's like in Washington, why this is necessary, kind of the taxpayer's perspective on why a revenue limit is important, why property tax relief, especially in Washington, is important, and how Washington can maybe follow a trajectory of a Texas or an Indiana rather than a California or a New Jersey. This is very important, not only for the state, but the same as we look at Maine with question 4. It's important for taxpayers across the country because unless we get some sort of serious momentum behind serious reforms, we could have a million back-to-back 2008s with just and 2009s with the budget problems that we've had across the country. Unless states really start to wake up and get their state governments off the fiscal roller coaster and onto steady ground, we're going to have problems over and over again.
That's especially important for a place like Washington state because unlike places without income taxes elsewhere around the country, Washington state has one of the highest state and local tax burdens in the country. It is regarded as a very inhospitable climate in which to do business, and it's getting worse. People in Washington are spreading lies about Initiative 1033, saying it's just like Colorado, it's just like other tax limitation measures. It is not. It is designed by Washingtonians for Washingtonians to restore the fiscal discipline that Washingtonians were once accustomed to. And unless that discipline is restored soon, Washington's status as one of the top 10 highest tax states will only grow worse, as will its economy. So once again, folks, that's taxpayers41033.com. If you live in Washington state, watch for us. We're going to be engaging in a lot of exciting activities there. If you don't live in Washington state, read the newspapers, watch TV. If the measure 1033 passes there, it'll pass in a lot of other states in subsequent years. We're hoping and praying that that will be the case. Thank you so much, Mr. Culling, for your expert commentary and opinion. Always a pleasure.
Hey, thanks for having me. Hopefully November 4th I can come back and we can celebrate a couple victories.
You betcha. We'll keep the champagne on ice. Well, that about does it for this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers. Remember, folks, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And we speak truth to power every week here on Speaking of Taxpayers. This is